Hey there, fam. Okay, composition is really important for comics and all of art in general. A lot of the concepts I talked about in my last video on comic flow are achieved by understanding how to compose your panels, meaning how you arrange each element in your panel so that your intention is conveyed. So composition can feel very daunting when you're new to things, and it's probably going to take a lot of trial and error to figure out how it works. And the extra fun part about comics is that each panel has a composition of its own, but the entire page also has its own composition. So you have to both think about them being strong on their own while being pleasing as a whole as well. Though when you're starting out, and this is all new to you, I think it's best to focus on making the compositions of each of your panels really strong on their own. And once you've got that down, ensuring that your panel flow is all together, you can then focus on getting more fancy and worrying about the whole after that. So like I said in the comic flow video, every panel should lead the reader's eye from the start of the panel to the focal point of the panel, meaning the most important part of the panel, typically a character or an object, speech bubble, whatever, and then on to the next panel. So before I sat down to write out my script for this video, I was looking through a bunch of the fundamental rules about composition and the principles of design just to refresh, because I learned all of it when I was in school learning art stuff, but it's been a while since I looked at it. But reading through it, I was like, wow, this is kind of overwhelming and way more than I could probably fit into one video. So, especially a video that doesn't have accompanying visuals. Anyways, so definitely go look at composition rules and the principles of design. That will really, really help you understand what I'm going to talk about more. But because I don't want to give you the wrong information, or I don't want to overwhelm people, I'm just going to talk about what I tend to consider most when I'm composing my own panels. So I guess it's the fundamentals, but kind of skimmed down. Okay, so what I usually consider about my compositions when I sit down to figure out the layout of a panel. And all of these I'm talking about the content within one panel, whereas in the last video I was kind of talking about the shapes of the panels and kind of the content that goes in them. Anyways, the first thing I focus on is the focal point. So when I'm composing a panel, I start there. I start with my focal point. What do I want my reader to focus on when they look at this panel? Usually for me, it's a character's expression, an action that's happening. Say if two characters are kissing, I want that to be the focus. Or, if someone's swinging a sword at someone, I want that to be the focus. Or say there's a specific object I need the reader to look at. Or maybe there's a portion of a setting I need my reader to look at. So say a house or the castle in the distance. So once I know what my focal point is, it's usually indicated in the script what's being focused on. So once I know what that is, where do I place it in the panel? The best tool I can recommend to you is the rule of thirds. Okay, so us humans, we like when images are divided into thirds. It's very pleasing. We like threes. It creates this kind of unbalanced balance. So say you take your panel and you cut it into equal thirds horizontally and then vertically. You'd want to place your focal point on one of these four intersections where those cuts intersect. That's where you can put your focal points. You can find lots of visuals on this if you just search rule of thirds on Google. There's so many images on it, you'll understand what I'm talking about. It's very visually pleasing when you put your focal points on these points, as it achieves that kind of unbalanced balance. It also gives you lots of breathing room in your composition to arrange objects around your focal point to point toward it. Though this isn't to say that all your focal points always need to be on these points. It's a safe bet to put them there, but you can place your focal point, say, in the center of your panel if you want things to feel balanced or symmetrical, and you can always play around and break the rules. But if you just want to go simple, the rule of thirds will not lead you astray. I find doing that tends to add tension to your compositions, which can add visual interest and kind of pull the eye around the page, or the panel, I mean. while as doing like a very symmetrical composition can make things feel very peaceful. So if that's what you're going for, go for it. So the second thing I tend to consider is movement. Since you're literally trying to like move your reader from one panel to the next, you're going to want to add movement to your composition. It also adds visual interest, obviously. So I primarily achieve this through my line work, but the placements of my elements and the way I treat shapes can also achieve this. So if you're ever thinking about lines, just remember that people's eyes will follow lines. If you have a straight line, people will follow it very quickly with their eyes. If it's a curved, more organic line, people are going to follow it more slowly to understand it. So using a mix of straight and curved lines can control the speed at which your reader looks at them, at the shape or whatever you're lining, and a mix of them will imply movement, even though it's just like a static image that is not animated and not moving. I've always been told that my lines are full of movement, or my drawings are full of movement, and I think that's because I do use a strong mix of curved and straight lines. I don't know if I have too many tips on how to achieve it. You just gotta practice and try your best, I guess. Well, understanding that will really help you a lot. Dynamism will also imply movement, so like dynamic shapes, meaning using elements that cut diagonally in comparison to the page or panel will have your reader's eyes moving around the panel a lot more than if it was, say, like a very geometrical, balanced, say, shape or line, like a square, or even like a very balanced circle can also be a very like geometric shape. Having a shape that's very like stable and kind of straight parallel lines, again, that can create this kind of symmetry feel and make it feel very peaceful and stable and almost static. Where using diagonal lines creates a lot more movement in the piece and a lot more dynamicness. So using a mix of very dynamic shapes and dynamic placements, as well as more like stable geometric shapes and placements, again, can create that kind of sense of movement and guide your reader's eyes around at different speeds. I guess like the best example I can think of like this, because like using dynamic shapes can also create mood in your pieces. So like if you imagine drawing a skyscraper, so if you used only straight up and down lines and like horizontal lines, it might be kind of boring. Like at that point it's just a box. But if you start to use diagonal lines, it can feel towering or scary or jarring, and it can be a lot more dynamic. So the third thing I tend to consider is rhythm or echoes. Again, this can add movement to your composition. People easily grasp onto patterns. Our brains are kind of built to find patterns in things. So if you have something that is echoing throughout your piece, say it's like triangles or something, or circles or wavy shapes, people will start to look for that repetition of shape or line or whatever it is, and follow along with it. So for example, if you have a character whose hair is flowing in the wind and it's very wavy and it's got like very flowing wavy shapes to it, and in the background of your panel you use like flowy wavy shapes for the clouds, or maybe like the lake behind them, it starts to create this echo or this pattern, and your reader will follow these echoes throughout the piece, and it can imply movement, it can create unity or balance in your composition, and obviously you can use it to kind of direct them where you want to look. It's like follow the little breadcrumbs of this echoing shape. Number 4 that I also consider is scale. So how big or small are elements in comparison to each other? That can do a lot for your composition and make it feel more dynamic. Initially, when someone looks at your panel, their eyes are going to be drawn to the biggest, darkest shape in your composition. So that's something you always need to consider when you're figuring out, say, your focal point, or the element that you want to lead to your focal point. So, you can always use, say, like your biggest shape to point towards your focal point, which might be smaller. You can have the focal point be the biggest thing. For example, like getting a character's expression in a panel, that could be the biggest part of the composition. Using different sizes and scales for different elements can also create depth for your pieces, for your panels and content, etc. For example, if you have a larger element, it's going to read as closer especially if it's overlapping on top of other things. Whereas if you have a smaller element, it may look farther away. And obviously you can show that something is big by putting something small in front of it, etc. But overlapping can imply space. It can create dynamicness by having those different lines overlap, etc. And you can also achieve different moods by using scale. So scale is very important to consider, and it can help you with directing the eye in the right way, the eye of your reader. So yeah. And finally, I always need to make sure that I add some breathing room to all of my panels. So unless you're trying to make like your panel feel very claustrophobic or crammed in, don't crush your focal point close to the sides of your panel. Don't have your panel so close that it's like touching your characters at all times. Give a little space around things. Give a little space around your speech bubbles and your focal points and your characters, just so that they are easier to read. If there's negative space around them, it will allow an easier understanding of their shape and who they are, or what they are, whatever it is. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't have elements of the composition touch the edges of the panel. Like, obviously, you're going to have, background elements touching the edges of the panel. You're going to have different characters touching the edge of your panel. But always make sure that you're leaving a little negative space around the focus points of your panel. Again, just so things don't feel crammed or claustrophobic or hard to read. So don't put your super important details right at the edges where people aren't going to want to look at them because they're annoyed. Okay, so there you go. That was me stumbling through composition. I hope it made sense. I'm not super confident, especially with my last few points there, but I did my best, and that's all I can hope for. So if all this stuff seems intimidating or even confusing right now, focus on the rule of thirds and placing your focal points. I think that's the most important thing to figure out when you're first working on your comics, because everything else you can kind of build around that. And it'll get easier the more you study composition and comics that you enjoy, and you'll start to see what they did to get their flow and their compositions right. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. I guess I'll see you guys next time. Thank you, Bones, for editing this. I flubbed up a lot, so thanks, babe. You're really sweet. It will. Make sure to tune in tomorrow to see Bones' video, because he's a sweetie. And make sure to subscribe if you want more stuff about comics and stuff. And I'm tired, and it's my bedtime, and it's really hot outside, so I'm very, frazzled and tired. So I'm gonna go to bed. Okay, bye!